Welcome to the Duck Dive, the show where we take a stack of research, articles, and insights and turn them into your shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're going on a fascinating journey, really trying to decode the digital mind. We're diving into something I think almost everyone experiences, that moment you're scrolling through social media, seeing all those carefully curated lives and feeling that familiar, almost involuntary twinge of, am I missing out? We're going to unpack the intricate, often invisible connections between that fear of missing out, FOMO, and how we inevitably compare ourselves to others online, plus the delicate balance of our self-esteem, and even the maybe surprising power of simply being our authentic selves in this digital space. It's really about understanding the subtle yet profound forces that shape our daily digital lives. Think of it as a shortcut.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this deep dive, it's going to synthesize crucial insights from several really pivotal studies. Each one casts a slightly different light on our online behaviors. We'll be exploring a significant serial mediation model, sounds complex, but we'll break it down that meticulously maps the journey from FOMO right through to problematic social media use. It reveals the hidden steps in between. Alongside that, we'll look at some groundbreaking longitudinal research that means research over time on how authenticity actually shapes our mental health. It presents a really powerful counter-narrative. And we'll round it out with some foundational perspectives on why do we share content online in the first place, including the sometimes surprising influence of traits like narcissism.
Right. So our mission today is to equip you, our listener, with a truly nuanced understanding of these dynamics. We want to move beyond, simple pronouncements or platitudes. Social media is bad. Social media is good. To truly grasp the why and the how of our digital existence. Hopefully offering valuable, actionable insights for promoting healthier online habits and ultimately improving your overall psychological well-being. Think of it as a guide, maybe, to navigating the complex landscape of your own digital mind. Okay, let's unpack this first piece. We all use social networking sites. I mean, whether it's Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, whatever's new this week, they offer incredible avenues for social interaction, right? For gathering information, and sometimes just for pure entertainment, killing time. But there's a delicate line, isn't there? When does that engagement, which starts off seemingly harmless, maybe even beneficial, when does it cross over into what researchers call problematic social media use, or PSMU? What does that even look like in real life? Is it just spending too much time?
That's a crucial question, and it's constantly evolving, partly because the platforms themselves are always changing, right?
Yeah.
So while a formal, universally agreed upon clinical definition is still challenging to pin down, empirical research does offer a clear and I think practical indicator. Involvement becomes problematic, potentially leading to something akin to a behavioral addiction when there's a perceived need for users to be constantly online. It isn't just about the sheer hours spent, although that could be part of it. It's more about feeling this compulsive, almost inescapable urge to be perpetually connected, always checking, always refreshing your feed, maybe even when you know you should be focusing on something else like work or talking to someone in the same room.
That gnawing feeling.
Exactly. That gnawing feeling that if you step away, even for a little bit, you'll miss something absolutely vital. This constant perceived need, this compulsion, it can really take an excessive toll on an individual's life and their overall well-being. It sort of moves beyond a cautious choice, doesn't it? It starts to feel like a requirement, encroaching negatively on other healthier areas of life like your sleep, your work performance, or even genuine in-person relationships.
So it's that feeling of being tethered almost against your will rather than just, dipping in and out when you choose to. That sounds exhausting, frankly. What are the tangible, the real-world consequences for our mental well-being when social media use crosses that line and becomes problematic?
Well, the evidence here is quite stark, unfortunately. Recent meta-analyses, and these are incredibly powerful studies because they combine data from many different individual research projects. They consistently reveal a very strong and concerning association between PSMU and adverse mental health effects. This seems particularly pronounced among young people who've often grown up with this technology, digital natives. When we talk about these effects, we're notably seeing increased symptoms of, depression, anxiety, and stress.
Big three.
Yeah. Imagine feeling that persistent low mood or that undercurrent of worry or just a constant sense of being overwhelmed and realizing how that might be intertwined with your social media habits. Now, it's worth noting, the findings on gender and age differences in prevalence have been a bit mixed across studies. It's not totally clear-cut. For instance, while some research points to females as potentially being at a higher risk factor for developing PSMU specifically, other findings indicate that males might have a higher prevalence of what's broadly termed internet addiction or, say, gaming addiction.
So different flavors of problematic online use, maybe?
Kind of. It suggests that while problematic online engagement impacts broadly, the specific ways it manifests might differ based on demographic factors. It definitely needs more granular investigation. But regardless of those nuances, the core finding remains. Problematic use is strongly linked to these significant and often quite debilitating mental health challenges.
Okay, so beyond just the general mental health struggles like depression and anxiety, which are already a heavy burden, are there other, maybe even more concerning links that research has uncovered?
Unfortunately, yes. The impact seems to extend further. One particularly striking meta-analysis, and this involved a huge sample, over 67,000 adolescents. It indicated positive small to medium correlations between PSMU and engagement in risky behaviors more generally.
Risky behaviors, like what?
Well, this isn't just about what happens online. It includes things like substance use, alcohol, drugs, and also risky sexual behaviors. You can sort of think about the potential psychological bridge there, perhaps. Maybe problematic social media use, with this constant seeking of novelty and validation, might lower inhibitions or increase impulsivity.
That fence.
Or perhaps certain online communities might normalize or even, in some cases, encourage these risky behaviors. This really highlights that the impact of PSMU is far from confined to the digital realm. It can broadly influence real-world decision-making and potentially lead to a range of concerning behavioral patterns. The correlation suggests this complex interplay where problematic social media engagement isn't isolated, but it's intertwined with broader risk-taking tendencies in an individual's life. It's a significant warning sign, I think, that needs our attention.
Wow, so it's not just feeling a bit down or anxious. It can actually be tied to more severe, even dangerous behavioral patterns in real life. That's a powerful and, frankly, alarming connection. This really elevates it beyond just a lifestyle quirk. It sounds like a genuine public health concern.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the theoretical underpinnings,
Yeah.
it often aligns quite well with what's known as compensatory internet use theory.
Compensatory use, meaning using it to make up for something else.
Exactly. This theory suggests that many individuals initially go online, not necessarily for connection or even entertainment, but primarily to escape real-life problems, or maybe to alleviate what psychologists call dysphoric moods, those general feelings of unease, unhappiness, or distress. Imagine someone feeling lonely or anxious about an exam or stressed about work, and they instinctively reach for their phone.
Right, the quick fix.
Yeah, hoping for a distraction, maybe a brief moment of connection, or perhaps that fleeting sense of validation from a post getting likes. While this might offer temporary relief, a brief escape, it can quickly lead to deeply negative outcomes for the individual in the longer run. Instead of actually solving the underlying issues, the internet, and specifically social media, becomes this temporary balm that ultimately might exacerbate the wound.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Sort of, yeah. It establishes a vicious cycle where the escape itself becomes the problem, driving further problematic use and deepening the very issues it was meant to alleviate. They might choose the screen over real-world interactions that could actually foster genuine well-being, getting trapped in this loop.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think, because we're about to explore one of the most significant, almost ubiquitous drivers in this whole landscape of social media use. FOMO, the fear of missing out. We hear this term thrown around a lot, right? Almost casually. But what precisely is FOMO? How does this pervasive anxiety manifest in our daily lives, especially when we're constantly plugged into social media? What does it actually feel like for someone?
Right. FOMO is essentially this pervasive apprehension. It's a constant kind of nagging anxiety that others might be having rewarding experiences that you are absent from. It's not just a passing thought like, oh, I wish I was at that party. It's often characterized by that persistent worry or concern that you're somehow not living up to the perceived experiences of others, particularly those experiences that are meticulously showcased and, let's be honest, often idealized online.
The highlight reel.
Exactly, the highlight reel. Think about it. You're scrolling through your feed, maybe on a Tuesday night, feeling a bit bored, and you see friends at a vibrant party you weren't invited to, or someone's posting pictures from an exotic vacation you definitely can't afford, or even just someone having a seemingly perfect, joyous day while you're stuck doing chores or feeling a bit down. That sudden pang of inadequacy, that feeling of being left behind, or maybe just not being in the know about what's happening that's FOMO in action. There's actually a fear of missing out scale researchers use, and it includes items like literally I fear others have more rewarding experiences than me.
Oh.
It really captures that underlying unease and that nagging feeling of being excluded or simply, not being where the action supposedly is.
That makes perfect sense. We've all felt that pang, I'm sure. So does this fear, this FOMO, does it directly lead to problematic social media use? Or is it more nuanced than a simple one-to-one cause and effect? Is it just a trigger, or is it something more complex driving the bus?
Well, prior studies provide pretty clear and consistent evidence of a direct and positive association between FOMO and problematic use across various social media platforms. We're talking about the big ones: Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Snapchat, you name it. The research shows that FOMO uniquely predicts problematic social media use. That means it's a distinct and powerful factor, even when researchers statistically account for other significant personality variables.
Like personality traits?
Exactly, like how extroverted or neurotic someone is, or their various attachment styles, how secure they feel in relationships. FOMO still stands out. This suggests that it's not just about who you are as a person generally, but specifically this fear of being left out acts as a potent precursor to increased and often problematic social media engagement. This persistent anxiety, it can fuel a whole range of negative emotions and what psychologists call affectivity associated with social deficiencies. Like rumination, that tendency to endlessly replay negative thoughts or situations in your mind. Why wasn't I invited? Why is my life so boring compared to theirs?
Yeah.
So that feeling of inadequacy or being excluded can become this kind of internal echo chamber that then drives that compulsive checking behavior we talked about.
So the sheer anxiety of being left out compels us to engage more, to constantly check and stay connected, almost as a defensive mechanism against that very feeling. It's like, if I just stay online, maybe the fear will go away.
Precisely. And it's often a self-perpetuating cycle, isn't it? The fear drives the engagement.
But then the engagement shows you more things to potentially fear missing.
Exactly. You're constantly exposed to more of what you perceive you're missing.
It's a tricky loop. Okay, let's talk about that feeling, that reaction, when you see someone's seemingly perfect post. Maybe it's that perfectly filtered vacation picture, or a shiny new car, or an unbelievably happy family photo, and instantly, maybe even subconsciously, you compare it to your own life. We've all done it. This brings us directly to social comparison. What is its fundamental purpose in human psychology? I mean, why do we do it at all? And then how has social media just amplified it to such an unprecedented, almost inescapable degree?
Right, social comparison. Well, as originally proposed by the pioneering psychologist Leon Festinger way back in 1954, it serves a very fundamental and, frankly, innate human purpose: self-assessment. We as individuals instinctively evaluate our own abilities, our opinions, our achievements, even our general standing in life by comparing ourselves with others. In a primal way for us to understand where we stand in the social world, to gauge our progress, or maybe just to validate our own thoughts and feelings. Am I normal? Am I doing okay?
Kind of like calibrating ourselves against the group.
Exactly, a calibration tool. What's fascinating here, though, is how the specific nature of social media has radically altered and, as you said, supercharged this innate human tendency. The visually oriented nature of platforms like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, it makes it incredibly easy, almost instantaneous, for individuals to quickly compare themselves. And crucially, it's not just comparing yourself to people you actually know, your immediate friends and family whose lives you might have more context for. It's also comparing yourself to complete strangers, to celebrities, to influencers whose lives are often presented in an incredibly idealized, highly curated, and sometimes completely manufactured fashion.
Yeah, it's not reality.
Often not. This constant, easy access to what are predominantly upward social comparisons, where we compare ourselves to those we perceive as better off or more successful in some way, creates an environment ripe for perpetual self-evaluation against potentially unrealistic or even, completely fabricated benchmarks. It's like being on a comparison treadmill that's incredibly hard to step off of.
And what are the common outcomes of this constant digital comparison? It certainly doesn't sound like a recipe for healthy self-assessment, more like a recipe for feeling bad about yourself.
The existing literature definitely bears that out, and the outcomes are largely negative, unfortunately. Engaging in social comparisons on social media is consistently and positively associated with greater social media use.
So the more you compare, the more you use it.
Yes, it seems to be a self-reinforcing feedback loop. The more you compare, perhaps the more inadequate you feel, and then the more you use the platform, maybe seeking validation, or maybe trying to present your own curated self to compete. When individuals specifically compare things like social skills or performance abilities online, it's not only linked to increased FOMO and social media use, but crucially, it's negatively associated with overall well-being. This can manifest in various ways, from general dissatisfaction with one's own life to feelings of envy, frustration, all the way to more severe mental health impacts. It can even affect perceptions of social support. Individuals might perceive limited social support if they believe their friends are significantly better or more successful than them, based on these online portrayals.
That's ironic, feeling isolated while looking at your friends.
It is deeply ironic. That feeling of inadequacy or being behind can paradoxically lead to a sense of isolation, even while you're digitally surrounded by hundreds or thousands of so-called connections.
So the very act of comparing itself seems to drive more usage, often with very negative emotional consequences, perpetuating that cycle we talked about earlier with FOMO. It's like constantly picking at a wound, hoping it will somehow heal by doing so.
Precisely. The data strongly indicates that engaging in more social comparisons on social media is consistently linked to lower self-esteem. It's a direct and powerful connection. Furthermore, how individuals compare themselves to their friends online can even influence their self-esteem and significantly the amount of effort they put into editing their own photos and posts.
Ah, the filtering and crafting.
Exactly. Think about the time and energy spent perfecting a selfie, choosing just the right filter to hide perceived flaws, or crafting the perfect witty caption. People might meticulously curate their online persona to attract attention, to project a flawless image, often in a desperate attempt to manage how they are perceived in these constant, often unforgiving comparisons. This raises a really crucial question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If we're constantly editing our lives and comparing ourselves against these edited versions of others, how does this complex interplay directly impact our very core, our sense of self-worth, our self-esteem?
Self-esteem.
Yeah.
Yeah, our fundamental orientation towards ourselves, that core sense of worth. It seems to be so deeply entwined with our social media experiences. It doesn't feel like just a casual connection. It feels like the digital world can really shake us to our core sometimes, profoundly influencing how we see ourselves. What's the nature of this complex and maybe even contradictory relationship?
Well, what's truly fascinating, and perhaps a bit confusing at first glance, is that social media use can seemingly both increase and reduce self-esteem. It's not straightforward at all. It really is a double-edged sword. On one hand, for some individuals, particularly when they receive abundant positive online social feedback, think about getting a flood of likes on a post, or lots of affirming comments, shares, validating messages. Engaging in these social media activities can indeed lead to a temporary boost in self-esteem.
That little rush.
Exactly, that little rush. And this isn't surprising when you consider the underlying psychological and neurological mechanisms at play. Research actually shows that these platforms are meticulously designed, often using principles from behavioral psychology, to drive dopamine surges in our brains.
Dopamine, like the reward chemical.
Precisely. It's similar to the neurological reward systems activated during activities like gambling, where the anticipation and the intermittent, unpredictable reward keep you hooked, keep you coming back for more. That sudden rush from a like or a validating comment becomes highly reinforcing, encouraging frequent visits and interactions to get that fleeting reward. So yeah, it can feel incredibly good, at least for a moment, like a quick hit of validation.
But there's always a but, isn't there? There's a precarious, maybe even dangerous flip side to that coin. That temporary boost sounds like it probably comes at a cost.
Absolutely. And it's a significant flip side that for many often outweighs those temporary highs. While some might report those positive, albeit fleeting, effects, the data consistently shows that engaging in more social comparisons on social media is robustly linked to lower self-esteem. It's a very consistent finding across multiple studies. For example, when people perceive their social media friends as being more popular or more successful or just leading more exciting lives based on their posts, their own self-esteem tends to be lower.
That makes intuitive sense.
It does. And aligns perfectly with a well-established psychological theory, Tesser's theory of self-evaluation maintenance from 1988. This theory explains that engaging in upward social comparisons, that is, comparing yourself to someone you perceive as better off or having more, can trigger a whole range of negative emotions. These emotions can include things like envy, inadequacy, frustration, and these negative feelings in turn subsequently reduce an individual's self-esteem. So the very pursuit of validation, often driven by these comparisons, can become this psychological trap that actually undermines the very self-worth it desperately seeks to affirm or boost.
So the search for validation can ironically undermine the very thing it seeks to boost. It's such a counterintuitive, almost tragic dynamic playing out on our screens every day. Given that, how does self-esteem itself, especially maybe lower self-esteem, then influence problematic social media use? Is it a cause and effect, or maybe both tangled up in a vicious cycle?
It's definitely a complex interplay, a reciprocal relationship, but research strongly suggests that individuals starting with lower self-esteem often exhibit higher levels of social media activity, particularly problematic activity. It seems that lower self-esteem can serve as a potent motivation for particular ways of using social media, perhaps as a kind of coping mechanism, however maladaptive.
How so?
Well, these individuals might seek out online spaces specifically for the approval or validation they feel they lack in their offline lives. Or they might meticulously craft an idealized self-presentation online that masks their underlying insecurities. They might post more frequently, constantly seeking that next hit of dopamine from likes, or they might curate an image that projects a success or happiness they don't genuinely feel internally. However, the inverse is also true, and this is important. Robust, healthy self-esteem usually leads to a much more balanced and adaptive approach to technology use.
Acting as a buffer.
Exactly. It acts as a protective factor. People with strong, stable self-esteem are generally less dependent on external validation from others, and therefore less susceptible to the allure of constant comparison or the compulsive need for online approval. Conversely, when FOMO further erodes an already vulnerable self-esteem, it can create this powerful downward spiral. It drives individuals to seek refuge in compulsive social media use, desperately seeking approval and external validation in a continuous, often unfulfilling loop. It becomes a deeply entrenched, vicious cycle where the attempts to boost self-esteem via social media paradoxically lead to behaviors that further diminish it.
Okay, this is where the core study we're exploring today really connects the dots, showing a precise, step-by-step psychological cascade. It's like seeing the invisible forces at work, domino by domino falling. Tell us about this serial mediation model that the researchers investigated and what it meticulously reveals about the relationship between FOMO, social comparison, self-esteem, and problematic social media use. How does it all fit together?
Right, this specific study, which is really central to our deep dive today, aimed to explore the mechanisms through which FOMO affects social media behavior. It wanted to move beyond just saying FOMO is linked to PSMU and understand the intricate how. The researchers proposed a sequential pathway, essentially a psychological domino effect. They hypothesized that FOMO influences problematic social media use not necessarily directly, but rather indirectly and sequentially. First, FOMO leads to increased social comparison. Then, that increased comparison leads to lower self-esteem. And finally, that lower self-esteem contributes to problematic social media use.
A chain reaction.
Exactly, a chain reaction where one psychological state triggers the next, ultimately culminating in the problematic behavior. The study used a sample of Italian university students to empirically test if this proposed chain of events actually held true in the real world.
So it's not just a simple equation of FOMO makes you use social media too much, but a much more intricate psychological journey. What were the key findings? Did the model hold up? Which dominoes fell, and in what specific order?
The results strongly supported this crucial sequential relationship, painting a really clear picture of the cascade. Let's break it down. Maybe imagining someone, let's call her Sarah. First, the study confirmed that FOMO had a significant positive direct effect on social comparison.
Meaning more FOMO leads to more comparing.
Exactly. This aligns perfectly with the idea that the constant anxiety of missing out on interesting online social events actively triggers a more frequent and intense process of comparison. So imagine Sarah scrolling her feed, seeing a friend's amazing vacation photo. That initial pang of, oh, I'm missing out, isn't just a fleeting feeling. According to this model, it immediately triggers a deeper, almost involuntary thought process. Why isn't my life that exciting? Why am I not there? This heightened state of comparison becomes the second domino to fall.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the self-esteem part of the chain? How did that fit in after the comparison started?
Right. Following that increased social comparison, the study found a significant negative association between social comparison and self-esteem.
So more comparing leads to lower self-esteem.
Precisely. In simpler terms, the more Sarah compares herself to others on social media, especially when those comparisons are upward, to people she perceives as better off or more successful, the lower her own self-esteem tends to dip. So, Continuing with Sarah's experience, after comparing her own life to her friends' idealized vacation snaps, that thought, why isn't my life that exciting, starts to erode her confidence, making her feel inadequate or less than. This is a critical link in the chain. Finally, completing the sequence, the study found that lower self-esteem was significantly negatively associated with problematic social media use.
Meaning lower self-esteem predicts more problematic use.
Yes. The more Sarah's self-esteem suffers from these comparisons, the more likely she is, according to this model, to seek refuge or validation in compulsive social media use. She might impulsively check her phone again, maybe seeking distraction or another dopamine hit, or perhaps she meticulously crafts an even more curated post of her own, desperately seeking that external approval. Trapped in the very cycle that started with FOMO, all because her self-esteem has taken a significant hit along the way.
So if I'm tracking this intricate sequence correctly, the full cascade revealed by this model is FOMO leads to increased social comparison,
Right.
which then leads to lower self-esteem,
Yep.
which finally contributes to problematic social media use. That makes incredible, almost intuitive sense when you lay it out like that. But here's a critical point, and this is truly fascinating. Was FOMO directly linked to problematic social media use in this specific model, or was its influence entirely indirect, working only through those intermediaries of comparison and self-esteem?
This is precisely what's so insightful and really a key takeaway from this particular study. The direct path, the arrow going straight from FOMO to problematic social media use, was not significant in their final model.
Wow, really?
Yes. This means that, within the context of their model and their data, the effect of FOMO on problematic social media use was fully mediated by the sequential roles of social comparison and self-esteem. In other words, these two factors, social comparison and self-esteem, completely explain the relationship between FOMO and problematic social media use in their sample. Social comparison alone was a very powerful mediator in this chain, explaining a substantial 32% of the variance in problematic social media use. That's a big chunk. So while FOMO might be the spark that kicks off the initial anxiety and maybe drives the user to the platform in the first place,
It's the subsequent journey through intense comparison and the resulting erosion of self-esteem that actually fuels the problematic behavior itself.
exactly. It's not just a direct trigger. It's more like a catalyst for a cascading psychological process that ultimately takes a heavy toll.
That's a truly huge insight for understanding our digital minds, I think. It suggests that if we want to address problematic social media use that seems driven by FOMO, it's perhaps not enough to just tell people to get over FOMO or don't worry about missing out.
Mm.
Instead, it implies that effective interventions might need to focus on breaking this specific chain, maybe by tackling the patterns of social comparison directly, or by actively working on nurturing and protecting self-esteem. It means solutions need to be more sophisticated than just log off more.
Exactly right. It completely shifts the focus from looking for a single cause to understanding a complex sequence of events. And that offers potentially far more targeted and effective avenues for intervention and for promoting healthier online habits. It's about addressing the why behind the what, not just the what itself.
Okay, we've talked quite a bit about the challenging aspects of social media, the potential pitfalls, FOMO, comparison, low self-esteem, problematic use. It can start to feel a bit grim, can't it? But our sources, the research we're diving into, also introduce a really compelling and frankly quite uplifting idea as well, a counterpoint. Could truly expressing your authentic self on social media actually be good for you? Can it be a source of psychological strength and well-being, rather than just a source of vulnerability or anxiety? This feels like a really powerful counter-narrative.
Absolutely, and it's a vital perspective to include. The Bunker et al. Longitudinal study provided some really compelling evidence for exactly this positive dynamic. They found that perceiving oneself as authentic on social media precedes or comes before fewer mental health symptoms 2 months later.
Precedes, so it suggests a direction. Authenticity first, then better mental health.
Exactly. That temporal finding is significant because it suggests a direction of influence, not just that the two things happen together. And when they talk about authenticity here, it's not just a vague notion of being yourself. It's a rich, multifaceted concept in psychology. It involves things like authentic living, meaning you act in ways that are consistent with your true self, your core values and beliefs. It also involves the absence of self-alienation, meaning you feel connected to your true thoughts and feelings. You don't feel like a stranger to yourself. And finally, it includes not accepting external influence, meaning you're not just behaving solely to please others or rigidly conform to societal pressures just for the sake of fitting in. When individuals genuinely embody these qualities in how they present themselves online, the study found clear mental health benefits, particularly a reduction in reported stress levels later on.
And you mentioned this was a longitudinal study. Just to remind our listeners, that means researchers followed the same participants over a period of time, right? Not just a snapshot. So it's not just observing that, hey, authentic people tend to have better mental health. It's actually pointing towards a direction of influence, maybe suggesting that cultivating authenticity leads to better mental health over time. That makes the findings even more powerful, lending more weight to this authenticity-first argument.
Precisely. That longitudinal design is key here. Their findings suggest that those initial self-perceptions of authenticity on social media predicted lower levels of negative mental health symptoms specifically. They looked closely at stress later on. But here's what's truly surprising, and maybe even counterintuitive, from their analysis. When they ran analyses accounting for both social media authenticity and offline authenticity, meaning how authentic people felt in their real-world face-to-face interactions, it turned out that only perceived authenticity on social media remained a significant predictor of later mental health, specifically for stress symptoms.
Wait, only online authenticity mattered for predicting later stress, not offline authenticity?
For stress, in their model, yes. That means, for that particular outcome, the authenticity people felt they expressed online seemed to be more impactful, or at least a stronger statistical predictor, than their perceived authenticity in their real-world offline interactions. It's a remarkable finding, quite unexpected.
That is genuinely counterintuitive. It really makes you wonder. For young adults especially, could being authentic online actually matter more than being authentic offline for certain mental health outcomes, like managing stress? That's a significant shift in perspective for how we might understand identity formation and well-being in our increasingly digital age.
It raises an incredibly important question, doesn't it? And perhaps for young adults, in particular, social media may be a uniquely focal context. It's a space where the positive benefits of authenticity might be experienced more acutely, possibly even more so than in some physical social contexts. This is a demographic, after all, that has largely grown up with social media, deeply integrating it into their social lives, using it as a primary space for self-expression, for identity exploration, for connecting with peers who share niche interests.
Finding their tribe online sometimes.
Exactly. Finding their tribe. The study suggests that individuals who perceive their social media self as authentic may be able to effectively mitigate some negative mental health symptoms, like stress. This could be because online spaces sometimes offer a unique avenue for self-expression, maybe finding those niche communities where one feels truly seen and understood, or perhaps for experimenting with different facets of identity in ways that offline interactions might not always easily allow for everyone, especially if their immediate physical environment is less accepting or understanding.
That's a fascinating possibility. Did the study identify who benefits most from this online authenticity? Were there specific characteristics of individuals who experience these positive effects more strongly than others?
Yes, they did look into that. And this adds another really insightful layer of nuance to the findings. The study found that perceived authenticity on social media seemed to mitigate negative mental health symptoms more significantly for those individuals who viewed themselves as more connected to and reliant upon others, and also for those who saw themselves as more variable across different contexts, meaning their sense of self might shift depending on the situation or who they're with.
Okay, so people who value connection and maybe adapt their behavior situationally.
Exactly. This pattern is consistent with what psychologists call an interdependent self-construal. These are individuals who tend to define themselves not primarily as unique, isolated entities, but rather more in terms of their relationships with others and their roles within a collective family, friends, community. They see themselves as fundamentally interconnected. This finding actually contrasts quite sharply with a traditional expectation, especially in Western psychology.
Which emphasizes independence.
Right, the expectation that an independent self-construal, which is generally more common in individualistic cultures like the U.S., and emphasizes uniqueness, personal achievement, and consistency across contexts, would show the strongest benefits of authenticity. But here it implies that for those who primarily see themselves as part of a collective, as interconnected with others, expressing their true self online might be particularly potent for their well-being, possibly because it helps reinforce and solidify those cherished social connections in a meaningful way.
So if your sense of self is deeply tied to your relationships and your place within a group, then being your true self online could be a really key factor for better mental health, maybe even more so than for those who prioritize their rugged independence. That really flips a lot of traditional psychological assumptions on their head, especially in Western context, doesn't it? It asks us to reconsider the very nature and function of authenticity in our digitally connected world.
It certainly does. It challenges our understanding of where and how authenticity truly thrives for different individuals in the digital age. And it really underscores the idea that online spaces aren't inherently good or bad,
Right.
but rather their impact is profoundly shaped by our underlying psychology, our cultural orientations, our motivations, and ultimately how we choose to engage with them.
Okay, so if social media use can be both problematic and potentially profoundly beneficial depending on how we approach it, let's dig into the why. What are the fundamental psychological motivations driving us to hit that post button in the first place? Why do we share? What compels us to put ourselves, our thoughts, our pictures out there for others to see?
That's a great question, getting to the core of human social behavior as it manifests online. A study by the New York Times actually delved into this and identified 5 primary motivations for why people share content online. They span a really fascinating spectrum, from quite altruistic to more self-focused reasons. First, maybe surprisingly, a remarkable 94% of people they surveyed reported wanting to better the lives of others by sharing content.
94%, that's huge.
It is. This points to a desire to be helpful, basically, to inform, to help, maybe inspire, or simply provide useful information like sharing an article about a new health breakthrough, or tips for a hobby, or information about a local charity event, a desire to add value. Second, 68% said they want the content they share to reflect their online identity. This is about self-expression, carefully curating how they are perceived in the digital world, building a personal brand online, so to speak.
Like showing off your taste in music or your hobbies.
Exactly. Sharing a song that reflects your current mood, like you mentioned that catchy Ed Sheeran track earlier, or posting a photo that captures your ideal self, or sharing achievements. It's identity construction. Third, a significant 80% reported sharing content primarily to grow and nourish relationships, using content as a bridge to connect with friends, family, colleagues.
How does that work?
Well, think about sharing a funny meme that reminds you of an inside joke with a friend, or posting a picture from a shared experience like a concert or a trip. It sparks conversation, it reinforces bonds, it keeps connections alive, especially over distance. Fourth, 81% share, because they genuinely like the feeling of having others comment and engage with their posts. That instant feedback loop.
Ah, the validation again?
Yes, that sense of validation, that quick hit of social approval. It fulfills that very inherent human need to be seen, to be heard, to feel like you matter to the group. And finally, 84% reported wanting to spread the word about something they deeply believe in, acting as advocates for causes, ideas, political viewpoints, or even just products they love. They want to be influential, to inform their network about something they consider important. And just to add another layer, Matthew Lieberman, a UCLA professor of psychology, observed something interesting in brain imaging studies. He noted that people seem inherently attuned to how things they see might be useful or interesting to others, not just themselves.
Thinking socially even when browsing alone.
Kind of. He said, "We always seem to be on the lookout for who else will find this helpful, amusing, or interesting." This indicates a strong outward social focus in our sharing habits, often driven by that desire for social connection, and maybe demonstrating our utility to the group.
That's a really interesting mix of motivations, spanning from quite altruistic, let me help others, to more self-focused, let me express myself or validate me, to relational, let's connect. It makes sense that we'd want to express ourselves and connect. Where then does something like narcissism fit into this picture? It feels like it could potentially be both a driver and maybe even a consequence sometimes, taking those otherwise maybe healthy motivations to an extreme.
That's an excellent point, and narcissism definitely plays a distinct and often problematic role here, frequently leaning towards the maladaptive end of that spectrum of sharing motivations we just outlined. Narcissism, psychologically speaking, is often understood through this deep underlying motivation to maintain a grandiose, highly inflated, yet fundamentally fragile and defenseless self-image.
Grandiose but fragile sounds like a contradiction.
It is, and that's key. Narcissists constantly seek approval and admiration from others, what's sometimes called narcissistic supply, to prop up this delicate ego, to fend off underlying feelings of inadequacy. And social media, being this highly social and public environment built on self-presentation, performance, and instant feedback, Well, it becomes a prime arena for this kind of self-construction and validation seeking.
A perfect stage.
Almost a perfect stage. Think about the pervasive selfie culture. Maybe the exaggerated boasts about achievements or possessions, the constant need for external validation in the comments section, maybe getting angry if they don't get enough likes. While this drive may indeed draw attention in the short term, fulfilling that immediate need for validation and reinforcing their inflated self-perception. The inherent lack of empathy and a potentially hostile, exploitative attitude toward others that often accompanies narcissistic traits can ultimately damage the very self and the relationships they are trying to establish or maintain in the long run.
So they might gain followers but lose friends.
Potentially, yes. They might gain superficial attention but alienate genuine connections because the focus is so relentlessly on the self. This creates this dynamic, recursive cycle. The search for external validation becomes this compulsive, never-ending quest that paradoxically undermines genuine connection and stable self-worth, making narcissism a strong predictor of social media addiction.
So that drive to reflect online identity, which, as you said, could be used adaptively, for example, sharing something enjoyable, like a favorite new song, just to nourish relationships and share joy. That same drive can also become a pathway to deeply maladaptive behavior, like social media addiction, especially when it's coupled with those narcissistic tendencies seeking constant external validation. It's like the same online tools and even the same surface motivations can be used for vastly different, sometimes opposing, ends.
Exactly. You've hit on a crucial distinction that really helps, I think, in decoding the digital mind. Many aspects of maladaptive social media use, things like narcissism, lower levels of empathy, excessive envy, impulsiveness. You could almost see them as exaggerated or unhealthy expressions of those individualistic and independent self-controls we talked about earlier. Traits and self-perceptions that overly emphasize the self as distinct, unique, maybe superior and self-reliant, often prioritizing personal gain or validation above connection. This stands in really stark contrast to the adaptive use of social media we observed, for instance, with the authenticity findings.
Where connection mattered more.
Right, where authenticity seemed particularly beneficial when it aligned more with an interdependent self-control, where individuals define themselves through their connections to others and seek shared experiences and mutual support. It really highlights that the outcome of our social media use isn't just about the platform itself, or even the initial motivation for posting. It's critically about the individual's underlying psychological makeup, their motivations, their self-perception, and how all of those interact with the specific features and pressures of the online environment. Are you primarily online to genuinely connect and share, or are you there to constantly prove your worth and compete? That fundamental difference often seems to determine the impact on your well-being.
This has been an incredibly comprehensive depth dive, really exploring the intricate psychological impact of social media, touching on everything from anxiety and addiction drivers like FOMO and comparison, right through to the surprising power of authenticity. As with all research, however, it's really crucial that we take a moment to acknowledge the context and the limitations of the specific studies we've explored. No single study can possibly tell the whole story, right? And understanding their boundaries helps us interpret the findings appropriately and also points towards important avenues for future research.
Indeed, that's absolutely essential for responsible interpretation. For that initial study, we discussed quite a bit, the one mapping the cascade from FOMO through comparison and self-esteem to problematic social media use. There were several important limitations to keep in mind that definitely affect its broader applicability. First, the participant sample was what researchers call a relatively small convenience sample. It consisted exclusively of Italian university students.
So, specific age group, specific culture.
Exactly. And furthermore, the sample was predominantly female. This specific demographic composition inherently limits how much we can generalize the findings to broader, more diverse populations, different age groups, different cultural contexts, different genders even. We can't simply assume these exact psychological pathways play out identically in, say, an elderly population in Japan, or a working-class demographic in Brazil, or even among male university students in Italy. Second, all the data collected in that study was self-reported. Participants filled out questionnaires about their own feelings, their own comparison habits, their own social media use.
Which can be tricky.
It can be. This raises the potential for social desirability bias, where participants might consciously or unconsciously present themselves in a more favorable light, perhaps underreporting problematic use or overstating positive feelings. It can affect the accuracy. Lastly, and this is a common limitation in these kinds of studies, its cross-sectional nature, meaning it captured data at just a single point in time, prevents us from drawing definitive cause and effect conclusions. While it showed strong associations and proposed a plausible sequence of mediation, it cannot definitively state that FOMO causes PSMU through this chain. Rather, it identifies a strong predictive relationship and a mediating pathway within that specific sample at that specific moment.
Right. Correlation isn't causation, as they say. And what about the longitudinal study on authenticity, the one that offered such a fascinating and uplifting counter-narrative? What were its specific limitations? Because even groundbreaking research inevitably has boundaries.
Absolutely. That study, while particularly powerful because of its longitudinal design allowing it to track changes over time, also had its own specific constraints we need to acknowledge. Like the first study, it was conducted with American college students and from a single university. Again, this limits its direct generalizability to other populations, non-students, different age groups, or other cultural contexts where authenticity might be understood or expressed differently. While college students are obviously heavy social media users, making them a very relevant sample for this research topic, they still represent a very specific demographic in terms of life stage, access to technology, educational level, and perhaps the specific social pressures they face. There was also a fairly significant attrition rate in that study.
Meaning people dropped out.
Yes, only about 53.3%. Just over half of the initial participants actually completed both time points of the study, the initial survey and the follow-up 2 months later. High attrition like this can potentially affect the statistical power to detect smaller effects. Or worse, it could introduce bias if the people who dropped out differed systematically from those who remained in the study. Maybe the ones who stayed were already doing better mentally, for example. While the researchers noted a gender imbalance in their sample and statistically adjusted for it in their analyses, a more balanced sample would certainly be ideal for future replication studies to confirm these findings more broadly across genders. And finally, a key conceptual point. That study focused solely on self-perceptions of authenticity. How authentic individuals are perceived by others on social media and what impact those external perceptions might have on mental health remains an open and really intriguing area for future research.
Does it matter more if you feel authentic or if others see you as authentic?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's likely complex.
So while these findings we've discussed provide invaluable, maybe even paradigm-shifting insights into the complex dynamics of our digital lives, they also very clearly open doors for future research. We need to explore these nuanced relationships in larger, more diverse samples, perhaps across different cultures, and ideally using even more extensive longitudinal designs, maybe combined with other methods beyond self-report. They give us a really strong foundational understanding to build upon, helping us truly decode more of the digital mind as we move forward. So, wrapping this all up, what does this deep dive really mean for you, our listener, as you navigate your own digital world every day? We've learned, I think, quite clearly that our social media experience is far from superficial. It runs deep psychologically. That little pang of FOMO, that fear of missing out, it isn't just a fleeting annoyance you should ignore. It can actually trigger a powerful psychological cascade, a chain reaction involving social comparison, hitting the delicate balance of our self-esteem, and potentially leading down a path towards truly problematic social media use. It's a complex, interconnected web, like a series of psychological dominoes.
And yet, as we've also spent time discussing, social media isn't necessarily some monolithic villain in itself, is it? It's more nuanced. The idea that truly expressing your authentic self online, particularly if you're someone who deeply values your connections with others, that interdependent self-construal we mentioned, that this authenticity can actually serve to protect your mental health. Well, that's a powerful and very actionable takeaway, I think. It strongly suggests that the way you choose to engage, and perhaps who you are when you engage online, makes a profound difference to your overall well-being.
It really encourages all of us, myself included, to think much more critically about how we engage with these platforms on a daily, even hourly basis. Are we inadvertently falling into those detrimental cycles of comparison, constantly measuring ourselves against idealized images and seeking endless external validation, maybe trying to fill a void that social media often just deepens? Or are we consciously leveraging these incredibly powerful digital spaces to genuinely connect with people we care about, to express our true selves within safe boundaries, of course, and to actually nourish meaningful relationships? Can we use it to foster a healthier digital mind?
This really raises an important question, a point of reflection perhaps for you to consider as you navigate your online world going forward. Maybe the next time you instinctively reach for your phone to open a social media app, or the next time you're about to hit post on something, just pause for a brief moment. Ask yourself, what is my primary motivation in this very moment? Is it being driven by that fear of missing out? Is it coming from a need for external approval or validation? Or is it genuinely rooted in a desire to connect, to share something meaningful, or to express who I authentically am.
Our hope today is that this deep dive has given you a clearer lens, maybe some new vocabulary and frameworks through which to view your own digital habits. We hope it's illuminated some of those often invisible psychological forces at play, and ultimately maybe empowered you just a little bit to make more informed, more intentional choices for your own psychological well-being in this complex digital age. Until next time on The Deep Dive, stay curious and navigate your digital world with intention.